Welcome to another edition of the CHDS Thesis Series. I'm Mark Pritchard, and today I'm joined by Calvin Shanks. He's the Senior Director of Safety Services and the Fire Marshal at Texas Tech University. Welcome, Calvin.
Thank you, Mark.
And your thesis is entitled Beyond Sister City Agreements. What exactly are sister city agreements, and how did you come up with that topic?
The sister city agreements, Mark, is the way that the federal initiative towards emergency preparedness along our border has been developed with our Mexican counterparts. What we've established along from Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and San Diego, there are 14 sister city pairs that have mutual aid agreements developed in order to respond to environmental, basically it was an environmental agreement, however it's developed into much more than that. What brought me to this point was in El Paso, there are restrictions on our agreement with Juarez that aren't seen in other places. And so what I wanted to look at, why? What are the issues, and what can we do, and can we overcome the issues that have been found to restrict our partnership with Juarez?
Now, one of the things I think is interesting, in your research, you specifically state southern border.
Yes.
What's the difference on the northern border with Canada? How are those agreements set up?
On the Canadian border, they're regional. You have emergency management agreement compacts that are regionally developed. There are 3 along the northern border, and they're, again, regional to the point that anybody within that region is a signatory, and those signatories are bound by the same agreement. On the southern border, everything is local. Everything is one sister city pair, and you have to develop it from there. The Canadian side, the agreements have addressed a lot of the issues that are found restrictive in the southern border. So a lot of these are environmentally based as far as their foundation goes. So we want to make sure that the natural resources that we share between our partners, that we come in, whether it's a hazardous materials emergency or some other event, we can come in and work together to help minimize the impact on both sides of the border. Regionally, you have the resources already pre-committed, and the signatories can come in and develop and request that those resources be deployed. The southern border, again, it's a local sister city agreement. You can get to state level resources, but everything's going to start locally between El Paso and Juarez, Calexico, San Diego, Tijuana, the Nogales, those areas. It's going to start between the 2 pairs, and the agreement is founded there.
So when we look at a sister city, I think we've all probably driven down a highway and it says sister city is X, Y, or Z. Are there good examples of relationships that you found in your research where you can point to specific sister cities on the southern border where the agreements are working, where we're sharing resources? Or is this problem specific only to El Paso where it's not working as well as it possibly could?
No, there are examples along the southern border, but for example, Nogales. In the Nogales area, they actually just recently, they had a fire that was right on the other side of the border. They set up an aerial tower, and from the U.S. side, they set up their 100-foot aerial, and they sprayed water from a master stream appliance onto a vacant motel, and they helped extinguish that fire. So there was collaboration, there was resource usage in that area. One of the things that we really find on the southern border are, with the exception of El Paso and Juarez and San Diego and Tijuana, the Mexican city is usually dramatically larger than the U.S. city. However, in El Paso, Juarez, there's 2.5 million people in the region. In the San Diego region, based on the numbers, you're looking at 5 to 6 million in the region, where the U.S. city is either comparable or larger than their Mexican counterpart.
Sure. Now, the other thing that I think that is probably unique, describe the geography, if you haven't been to El Paso, describe the geography of El Paso itself, the nature of the border, just looking at I-10, and also the fact, what's the next closest city? Right. And what kind of resources actually exist for a general population of 2.5 million, as you said?
Right. El Paso, Juarez, and San Diego, or excuse me, Sunland Park. we're the place where two nations and three states come together. So Old Mexico, New Mexico, and Texas all come together at the very tip of Texas. When you think about the shape of Texas, you got the very tip. So you have New Mexico, Old Mexico, and Texas coming together at that one point. There are places along the border where it's less than a quarter of a mile. I mean, you could pick up a rock and throw it to hit the opposite side. That proximity is something that we don't see very frequently in others. For example, San Diego, Tijuana, there's actual separation between San Diego and Tijuana. There is no actual separation other than the Rio Grande. And at this point, the Rio Grande isn't much of a river. I mean, it's there. Sure. It's dry much of the time. It's walking depth, those types of issues. So as you're driving through, right by the University of Texas at El Paso is probably one of the closest points. They narrow together. You can see and you could reach right across to the other side of the border. We had an issue where there was a smokestack on an old smeltering plant that needed to be demolished. The concern was if it fell the wrong way, it would land in a shanty town in Juarez. And so we needed to do some collaboration to make sure that didn't happen. But it's the proximity, until you've seen it, we are definitely one group of people divided by a little river and a fence.
Exactly. Now, the other part of your thesis research was basically identifying, here are the problems. When you look at taking the problems, does it lead directly to solutions that you can enact? Or how do you think this thesis will impact the future relationship of the collaboration between Juarez and El Paso?
Well, I'm hoping that it actually eliminates some of the barriers. Going back to the Canadian model, some of the issues concerning liability, they've already addressed them. And whether you're in Detroit or Windsor, your medical license or your firefighting license, it carries over, and they to the point where you're protected from liability if you're crossing. On the southern border, it's not as explicit into any of the agreements. So looking at what Canada's been doing on the Canadian side, we've been able to address some of the liability questions that still need to be answered on the southern border. So when you're crossing, what will happen if you get sued, or if you wreck the fire truck in your sister city on the other side of the border? There's potential, because there is a model that's shown that those issues can be overcome crossing an international border. Some of the other issues that are a little more problematic, you're dealing with local sister city agreements. So you're dealing with local politics. And so the local politicians and the pressures that have to be addressed, sometimes they get in the way. So ultimately, it's going to be a local governing body, local fire departments, local emergency management group, under their governing bodies that make the decision to can we or can we not.
Did your research tend to point to a consistency in these agreements existing for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Or did it turn out that this was mayor to mayor, and if there's an election, we've got to start from scratch? Or do they tend to continue through transitions of government officials?
Well, from the actual changing of the agreements, they've been fairly consistent. Now, for example, in El Paso in the 60s and 70s, there was crossing of resources into Juarez, but there was a political climate change. These agreements have been in place since the 90s and the 2000s, so they're fairly recent as far as getting them all finalized and formalized. So there hasn't been a lot of dramatic change administration-wise. But when one of the other issues, if we jump back to it, one of the things that we really have to deal with when we're looking at this, for the local people to make the decisions, whether it's in San Diego or El Paso or wherever the case may be, we have to look at optics, and we look at the national board. And unfortunately, the political climate we're in, build the wall, build the wall, build the wall, where these emergency management agreements say, hey, we need to pierce the wall and be partners. If something happens in our region, we've got to work together to deal with it. Violence, the role of violence was something that was extremely critical when we look at it, whether, again, Tijuana or Juarez. One point, El Paso was the safest city in America of its size at the exact same time that Juarez was the most violent city in the world. And so the threat of violence is something that the local politicians and the local responders have to take into account. Do you want to take the liability in such a violent circumstance to send responders over? One of the circumstances we look at, mass casualty incidents, whether we have an active shooter at an amusement park in Sunland Park, New Mexico, which is a half a mile away from El Paso, or we have an active shooter incident due to drug violence a quarter mile across the border in Juarez. What resources are we going to send in, and what is our liability there? So the points can be addressed on both sides. It just, how are we going to deal with it? How is the local entity going to deal with it? Because it truly turns out to be a local decision and a local partnership. And when we look at the benefits, though, of the international partnership and being a sister city that can set the example for global partnerships. Globalization has brought us economic interdependence. It has brought us such communication and the strengthening. El Paso has a 400-year history with its sister city. So at what point can we share the resources if need be? And it's not an everyday thing, but in a major event, can we? And can we look at that prohibition that's written right now, looking at the way it's done on the Canadian border, looking at how other smaller cities share their resources? Is there the potential for that collaboration that makes us fully functional partners, not just sister cities, but actual partners in the relationships that we have?
In your research, did you find there was much collaboration between sister city pairs? San Diego and Tijuana, El Paso and Juarez. Are we sharing lessons learned? Are we sharing ideas? Or is it still left very much to, that's a San Diego, Tijuana issue.
Right.
This is a Juarez, El Paso issue. We're not in the same family. We're not having the same discussions.
Right.
Or is that what you found?
Yes. I'm going to go back to local politics are a significant issue in this circumstance. And so the local players need to come together and take a look at truly, can we do what we're doing? You look at San Diego and Tijuana, I mean, there are a lot of economic agreements that they have in place. They work together, on a grand scale, yet in their agreements it specifically says we won't send resources to help. El Paso specifically says we won't send resources across the border. Though we have all of these other pieces of the puzzle together that make us fully functional partners, but in an emergency, we have something that says, right now we can't. Doesn't mean that we can't overcome it. And so that's my proposition, is to make us fully functional partners. There are agreements, there are examples of how we can do this. Though they are on a smaller scale, or on the Canadian border, they're on a regional scale instead of a local pair. There are things out there that can be looked at as possible models to help us be that fully functional partner.
So what would be your final step? Because that's what's so great about the CHDS thesis. It goes from research, writing, documenting to now it's time to put it into action. What's the implementation plan? How does it go from walking across the stage, diploma in hand, to hey, I've got a great idea? How do you put this into action?
Well, this one, again, the exploring of the limits. What I've tried to present here for the local officials is an example of what can we do to improve that partnership? What are the benefits of that partnership? Yet I want my steering committee, and that's ultimately the recommendation, is that the local entities put together a steering committee and say, okay, globally, how can we look at this? What is the benefit to actually changing the way we're doing business and allowing our resources to cross the border in an emergency for that partnership, to develop that fully functional partnership? So if we can step back, look at things globally, and give a full assessment, then we can make the determination. If the ultimate answer is, you know what, at this point in time, because of whatever limiting factors there are, we cannot change it to make the modification to our crossing the border, then so be it. But this at least gives an opportunity to make a full assessment and look at the benefits as well as the liabilities to our fully functional international partnership.
All right. Well, thank you, Calvin, for coming in. I think not only is your thesis relevant from an overall standpoint of what's really going on the southern border, but with current world events and everything else we're dealing with from a security standpoint, an immigration standpoint, finding solutions to these problems are going to be very critical, and I think this thesis will go a long way to at least opening the conversation. So I'd like to thank you for coming in. I'd like to thank everyone else for joining us for another one of our CHGS thesis series, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.